Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. We're going to have a great program, and we're delighted that you all could be here. I'm Virginia Reno. I'm Vice President for Income Security at the National Academy of Social Insurance. NASI, as you probably all know, is a nonprofit organization. We promote understanding of how social insurance contributes both to economic security for individuals and to a strong economy. We focus on social insurance programs such as Social Security, Medicare, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and we also focus on companion programs such as Supplemental Security Income. And SSI, I'm pleased to say, is our topic for today. We begin by taking a look at the history of SSI, and then we move on to SSI for beneficiaries today and some prospects for improving it for the future. We start today featuring a new book about the history of Supplemental Security Income. It has two distinguished co-authors, Ed Berkowitz, who is a professor at George Washington University, and Larry DeWitt, who until last year was the official historian of the Social Security program. Unfortunately, Larry had an dental emergency this morning and can't be with us today, so Ed is going to have to cover for both of the authors. There's much more about their bios in the material in your packet, so I won't go on with a lot of detail this morning. The first part of this program, as I say, is about the history. The two authors, or the one author, will present their key findings about the history of SSI from its inception in 1972 up through the mid-1990s, and will draw from that history some ideas and lessons for the future. Then we will have two commentators. Jennifer Erkelwater will be our first commentator. She's a political science associate professor from the University of Richmond. And 10 years ago, she had her first encounter with the National Academy of Social Insurance by submitting her dissertation for the Heinz Dissertation Award and won that dissertation award for a research on the SSI program. Our second commentator is Rebecca Vallis. She's an attorney with Community Legal Services in Philadelphia and has worked extensively on SSI from the client's point of view, representing people with disabilities and the elderly in their on issues with claiming benefits from both Social Security and the SSI program. A reminder, in your packets that you got at the desk out front, there is an evaluation form. And we take those evaluation forms very seriously. So please take a look at it now and fill it out through the course of the morning and leave it with us at the end of the session. We care about those because it's a way to improve these sessions in the future, and the people who pay for us to do this also care about those evaluations. The second panel, as I say this morning, will focus on SSI today and ways to improve it. And then we have scheduled the third part of the program, which we expect to be about 40 minutes, for conversation with all of our panelists back up front and with interaction with you in the audience. So please be thinking about the questions and comments you would like to make, and we will have plenty of time for that in the third part of the program. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ed, and then it'll be Jennifer and Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Virginia, and thank you for organizing the seminar. And I'd like to thank Alyssa Walker, too, who's here somewhere, who's done a lot of the staff work for this today. In Washington, we know that's the staff work that really matters on most things, right? And I'd like to thank you all for coming today, too. It's such an incredibly hot day. So the fact that you went outside and came here is very much appreciated by all of us. Most of us are, at least two of us anyway, are academics. We're used to speaking in these conferences where there's like 3 people in the audience and maybe 8 people on the, who do this because they get their way reimbursed if they're on a panel. So I'm used to speaking to no one. Unfortunately, I don't have very much practice in speaking to a large group like this, but I'll have to fake it as best I can. I also wanted to just apologize that Larry is not here, and So I will do, he actually prepared his own remarks, which I haven't seen before, so that'll be a kind of a novel experience in sort of stand-up comedy of one sort or other. But what I want to do is talk about the book, which I actually have a copy of here, and which I believe is available for sale outside in case you're so moved to buy it. It's called The Other Welfare, Supplemental Security Income in U.S. Social Policy, published by Cornell University Press. And Larry and I wrote it because we thought there had not been a comprehensive history of the Supplemental Security Income Program, and that it would be valuable to have it. We thought it would be of interest to academics like me, but maybe also to policy people and Washington people and advocates and consumers, like maybe some of you. And I guess so the conceit behind this book is that somehow history matters, that if you have a history, it helps you, even if you're dealing with the program in present time, as inevitably you are. So I was the academic of the team. And I was motivated somewhat by academic concerns, and in particular by a sort of a sense of misinformation that there is about this Supplemental Security Income Program. There's a very influential scholar who's written a book about welfare, and she writes that what happened was that old age assistance, aid to the blind, and aid to the disabled were, quote, folded into the social insurance system under the Supplemental Security Income Program. That left only AFDC as a maligned welfare program. This scholar really has no clue, that SSI is a welfare program, it's not a social insurance program. And indeed, as we're sure we'll hear today, it's simply not the case that the recipients of SSI have not been maligned over time. Instead, there's lots of different groups that have been singled out, children and substance abusers and immigrants and deinstitutionalized mentally ill and so on and so forth, all of whom have, in a sense, been stigmatized as a group and maybe stigmatized by the receipt of benefits. Larry DeWitt, who was until last year the historian at the Social Security Administration, he was sort of the public historian of the team, not the academic historian. And I think that because of his participation, the book has a lot more about sort of the nitty-gritty of public administration than it would otherwise have. He reflects in part the view from within the agency, what it's like actually to administer a program as opposed to an academic who is kind of looking at it from afar. If I had any kind of academic model in mind for this, it was probably the book by Martha Durthick, who's a political scientist at the University of Virginia, who wrote a book that some of you may know called Policy Making for Social Security, published by Brookings Institution. She talked about the different groups that contributed to making Social Security policy. What was striking to me was how the system had changed from her program that she talks about primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, and the SSI program in the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s. For example, you couldn't talk about Social Security without talking about the FFL-CIO. The unions were essential to the Social Security program, the main interest group here in Washington that were promoting the program. You could certainly write a history of SSI without talking about the labor unions. But if you couldn't write a history of SSI without talking about the courts. You couldn't write a history of SSI without talking about the media. And these are all things that are examples of sort of a modern welfare program, which we want to write about. Well, so what did we find? Well, we found, as probably most academics do, that origins matter. And the origins of SSI matter. Now, I wanted to just tell you a little origin story about SSI, because it's kind of an unlikely program in some ways that it ever kind of came to exist at all. It was created in 1972, and it was part of a 3-year-long effort by President Nixon, which began in 1969, to create a guaranteed annual income and pass what he called the Family Assistance Plan, which was his elaborate plan to expand the welfare system so that all families with children would be able to receive a welfare benefit. But we know that that failed. And SSI is part of the sort of intricate bargaining within that process. We have people like Wilbur Mills, who was the head of the Ways and Means Committee, who was very interested in expanding Social Security benefits, but was against indexing Social Security benefits to the rate of inflation, We had people like Russell Long, who was the counterpart to Mr. Mills in the Senate, and Russell Long was very interested in defeating the Family Assistance Plan. He used SSI as kind of a bargaining chip in that. He wasn't very convinced that the federal government should administer SSI, but he was gradually brought along to that view. So SSI then kind of reflected the conventional wisdom of its time, circa 1972. And the idea was that the program would be a supplement to Social Security, particularly people with low Social Security benefits, primarily the elderly. And unlike the AFDC program, or the TANF program, as we would say today, it was a program that didn't appear to be in crisis. The adult welfare categories were not increasing at a very rapid rate. Disability roles were a little bit, but the elderly roles were not. And furthermore, SSI was going to be welfare done right. It was going to take away the stigma of receiving welfare because it would have this association with the Social Security Administration, and it would be just kind of an income maintenance benefit, an income transfer, as we used to say, sort of like Social Security. There was going to be a seamless federal system, and it was going to be run in the highest tech manner circa 1972. And the big idea in 1972 was that the agency was going to use computers and was going to enter all the data, and that would essentially almost automatically create a system in which the right amount of benefit would go to the right person. Well, things didn't turn out that way exactly for a number of reasons, and that's our second lesson, which is that implementation matters. The program was passed in 1972. If you read the newspapers in 1972, you find all these optimistic statements about how the United States is in the middle of this long run of prosperity and many quarters of the economy growing and so on, and it just looked like a very optimistic point of view. But the program was actually put in place, it began in 1974. By that time, the energy crisis had begun, the stagflation had begun, and it was actually a very different economy. And as a result of that, and particularly because prices rose so much in that little interim period between passage and when the program began, Congress had to go back in and raise benefit levels. Each time they raised benefit levels, the poor people at SSA, who are programming these miracle computers, had to go back and change all the parameters. So that's one thing that happened. A program that was passed in this optimistic era was actually put in place in a rather pessimistic era. Furthermore, there was a political change. In the first administration, the Richard Nixon administration, they had a lot of liberals, particularly in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. For example, Elliot Richardson was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. In the second term, which was shorter than Richard Nixon, I think, had hoped it to be, but in the second term, he felt no compunction about replacing all these sort of liberal people like Elliot Richardson with more conservative people. And that made a difference with SSI because SSI was supposed to be sort of a federal effort. The whole idea is the federal government is taking over the welfare system in these particular categories. But the people that came to the leadership positions in HEW, as we used to call it, after 1972, were very sympathetic to the states, much less sympathetic to the federal government. And as a consequence, they were very easygoing in their relations with the states when the states bargained for the so-called state supplements, which are part of SSI. In addition to all of that, the Congress was quite different in the period after SSI was started than before. Well, Wilbur Mills really did run the Ways and Means Committee as a committee. They did everything as a committee of the whole. But then he was deposed. First he got sick and then he was deposed, so that by 1975 or so we began to have permanent subcommittees, and that changed the way that Congress looked at SSI. So another problem that was early on faced and that complicated SSI in its implementation was that there were all these things that had to be, all these political protections that had to be built into the program. The benefit that was originally created was not going to be as high as the benefit in many states like New York or other high benefit states. They were encouraged to supplement the benefits so that they brought their benefit up to that old level. And the government said, we'll administer those supplements. But it turned out not to be as simple as all of that. There were all sorts of protections that were built into the program, that the states should not have to pay more than they paid before. The beneficiaries should not be any worse off than they were before. And the federal government should not be out an excessive amount of money in making up the amount of money it had to pay to the states for these state supplements. All these things together, all these very complicated things, made the program very, very complicated and added complexity. And every added complexity meant that the program was that much more difficult to administer. Furthermore, these so-called state supplement programs that the states like New York negotiated were very, very complicated. The SSI notion was there's going to be this federal benefit level for everybody who's on this program. If you have no other income or resources, you get X amount of dollars. But the state said, in our supplement, our extra money we're going to pay in California or New York or Massachusetts or wherever it happened to be, we're going to preserve the traditions we had in our old programs. So if we had a differential between how much the blind received and how much the rest of people with disabilities received, we're going to maintain that. Or if we're in New York, which had a complex scheme of the federal government paid part, the state paid part, but the localities paid part, we're going to have a benefit level that's higher in New York City than it is in, say, upstate New York. And all of those things added complications. So the bottom line is that when the program began in January of 1974, it was perceived as a disaster. People didn't get their checks, people got the wrong check, people got too much, people got too little. And that actually became a front page story in January of 1974. For example, the New York Times ran this story which talked about thousands of poor people, some of whom were drug addicts, who jammed the city's 23 Social Security offices and described the resulting scene as chaos. And this was particularly hard for SSA to accept because SSA had at the time been known as this agency that implemented Medicare, which was also a very complicated program with its for these fiscal intermediaries and so on. It was complicated, but they did it. The perception was that they had succeeded in administering Medicare. There weren't any great disasters. People, left in the corridors of emergency rooms or something like that. But SSI was a very different animal. It was front page news that on its first day that it was not successful. And I think that influenced its development. So what happened after that? What happened after the implementation? Well, the program developed in different ways than policymakers had anticipated. That's key, I think, to understanding about SSI. When the program was created, the smart money here in Washington thought that the main beneficiary would be like a 68-year-old guy who was, an elderly guy, and it would qualify because of age and resources. But from the very beginning, they began to pick up more applications from people with disabilities than from the elderly. And although the aged started out with a little lead in terms of the number of people in the caseload, there was like a little scissors, and quickly the disabled became the main beneficiaries. And once that happened, that changed the whole tone of the program. This program, which was intended as a sort of a supplemental benefit to the elderly, all of a sudden becomes this major income support for people with disabilities. And it got caught up in this conversation that was going on in the 1970s about rising disability roles and what kinds of incentives were producing those rising disability roles. That became almost a cottage industry, trying to figure out why disability roles were rising, particularly in my house, actually. That was something that my father was actually interested in. And people began to look at the disability side of the program a little bit more closely, and they found all these peculiarities, like the disability determination process that was in the SSI program, but had actually been created in 1954, where states and the federal government shared responsibilities. So it didn't quite work out as well as people thought it would, and also worked out differently than people thought it would. So what happened then? The first thing that I would emphasize then in terms of looking at the long-range development of the program is there was is this important shift from being a program for the aged to becoming one for the disabled. And that meant that SSI picked up all of the problems of disability policy. The second big sort of unexpected thing that happened in SSI was that someone in the finance committee or somewhere put this notion that there should be children that receive benefits under SSI, which was a very anomalous thing, even at the time. But people said, well, it's a small little thing, we'll just put it in, because the children are, disabled children need more things than children who are in the AFDC program. They're not just poor, they're also disabled, so that they've created childhood disability benefits. And that was, as I said, just from the very beginning, very hard to figure out. Take a program which had very carefully picked up all of its institutional disability baggage from Social Security, and that included this idea that disability meant an inability to engage in substantial gainful activity, regardless of any employment opportunities in the nation, just inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity. That was the definition in SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. Well, I mean, that's been very hard to administer, as many of us know. But for kids, it really was a very common inability to engage in substantial gainful activity. Whatever that meant for children was not intuitively clear. But nobody cared about that at first because the numbers of children in SSI was small. But eventually it becomes an issue, as we'll hear more about, I'm sure, that there's a major court case which essentially changed the way in which SSA was expected to administer these childhood benefits. There was a major spike in disability benefits for children, and then Congress came in and said, this is wrong, we have to fix this, so they came in and legislated, and there was a kind of a tailing off, but then there was another surge in reaction to that, which emphasizes another point about this, which is that if you look at the program as people do today, you say, wow, the benefit rolls are rising. They fail to see that this has really been a cyclical phenomenon, that the rolls go up, people get alarmed about that, they tighten the program in some way, people get alarmed about the people who are taken off the rolls or don't get on the rolls, so they loosen up the program and we're back off to the races. So that cycle certainly applies to children and has become an important part of SSI politics. Another example of a group that kind of fell out of the SSI program is drug addicts and alcoholics, substance abusers, as they're sometimes called. There's a long history behind that, but this has been another thing to which congressmen have kind of continually rediscovered. My goodness, there are substance abusers on SSI. The government is paying money to a guy in Denver who runs a liquor store who just uses the SSI benefit to run up a tab and so on and so forth. And that creates political problems. Another group that's kind of fallen out of SSI and become a policy issue has been non-citizens. And that also has a long and complicated history. But the bottom line of that is it's very easy for someone like Senator D'Amato, who stood up in the Senate and said, it's really quite simple, folks. He said, if you're not a citizen, you shouldn't get benefits. And people were desperately looking for savings in the welfare program at this point. People said, yeah, that's right. And that became sort of a bipartisan issue. So what does all of this mean if you put it all together? Well, it means that origins matter in the program, that implementation matters in the program, that things often don't develop as they are kind of laid out to do or expected to do. And furthermore, and finally, it means that this program, which began as going to be the modern, destigmatized welfare program, and in direct opposition to the aid to families with dependent children, which had all these stories about mothers that were cheating on the rules and so on. It was going to be different from that. It was going to be welfare done right. But in fact, SSI developed problems of its own, which leads us to our present policy dilemmas. Thank you.
unfortunately, I'm like, Ed, I don't have pockets to plug my into, so I'm gonna have to hold it in my hand like a Walkman, if you don't mind. Well, good morning. I am very much looking forward to having a conversation about the politics of SSI, because like Ed, I'm an academic. I happen to be a political scientist, and as a political scientist, we tend to be more interested in the science of politics than actual politics. So I'm actually very interested in talking about politics. For those of you who haven't read The Other Welfare, it's a marvelous book. There's not a whole lot written in the fields of political science or history about disability benefits policymaking, but I think whatever is written is very insightful. This book is no exception to that. As a political scientist, what I'm interested in is thinking about how do we create socially just policies and how do we ensure that those policies are sustainable. And I think that this book offers many insights on that topic. The book is about SSI, but it's not simply about SSI. There are a lot of lessons that we can draw from this book and apply regardless of the specific program or policy that we're looking at. Now, when I take a look at the lessons that are offered by this book, the lessons about SSI, I'm struck by how sobering a lot of those lessons are. And there's two in particular that I will talk about. You know, Ed talked about how origins matter, how implementation matters, and the lessons that I draw from that are very similar. So I take a look at The Other Welfare, and one of the first lessons that I pull out from that book is the great hope that lawmakers at the time had that they were going to do something new. You know, a lot of the drive for SSI is to take these adult assistance programs, which lawmakers tend to look at as overly complex. The states were doing a terrible job administering it. That's part of the reason all these welfare rolls are going up. So let's just take these, put the national government in control, give it to the most respected agency in the federal bureaucracy. The SSA could take its expertise, its professionalism, plus take all the newfangled computer technology and apply it to creating a very rational and scientific program. But it's clear as you read the politics, the political history of SSI, that reform episodes never wiped the slate clean. And that's particularly the case with SSI. Here are lawmakers trying to do something new and put the federal government in charge, but insofar as SSI is a program for people who are poor, they reintroduce back into the program many of the things that made the administration of public assistance complex to begin with. So for example, we want this to be a clear, simplified, rational program. And that's not that difficult to do if you're going to administer a program for the aged. You just set an age of eligibility and you're done. On the other hand, insofar as it's a program for people with disabilities, well, what does that mean? How do you determine who's disabled? Well, there's a process that they inherited from disability insurance, but then we also have to think about the fact that some disabilities are more deserving than others. And lawmakers and citizens alike want to help the deserving disabled, and SSI tends to draw up more of those kinds of recipients than the public tends to think about as not deserving. Children with mental health problems, behavioral problems, people with substance abuse addictions, sometimes which are comorbid with mental health problems, and how do you separate all of those? People with chronic pain that may be very difficult to verify in any tangible and physical way. And so, particularly with SSI, the Social Security Administration is grappling with a lot more of these quote-unquote undeserving disabled, and that makes the administration of the program much more complex. Lawmakers wanted to make sure that you're giving benefits to people who can't work, but people who can work do work, and people aren't always disabled. Their medical condition changes. Okay, well, we have to have a way of reevaluating that, finding out who's able to work now, and then find some ways to get them into work. And people To the extent that people don't work, they don't work sometimes because of medical impairments, sometimes also because of social handicaps, racial discrimination, family situation, poor job market skills, a weak labor market. How do you fold those into a determination of disability? And those social handicaps would be just as important, if not more important, when you're looking at an impoverished population. So from the very beginning, because of the types of people that SSI was going to serve, the program would be extremely complicated if lawmakers wanted to make this distinction between deserving and undeserving. And a lot of the debates about SSI since have been about, well, how do we treat, what do we do with these individuals who are, quote unquote, undeserving of benefits. And at the same time that national lawmakers are trying to create this program that's going to be run by the federal government, they actually empower states quite a bit to affect how the program is going to be run. You know, it's ironic that the drive for SSI comes out of this criticism of state administration of public assistance, and yet because lawmakers allow for state supplementation, because states are conducting some of the disability determinations, the intergovernmental lobby has a vested interest in how this program is run. The program intersects with a lot of other programs like Medicare, Medicaid, AFDC, TANF, general assistance. And so in a lot of ways, the program became very unpredictable. Changes in these programs or changes at the state level were going to impact what happened within SSI in rather unforeseen ways. Right? I think one of the lessons that grow out of this episode is how difficult it is for reformers to create very simple programs to help people. Now, does all of this complexity matter? I think it does. And here's kind of the second lesson that I draw out from the book. When you've got programs that are complex and interact with each other in unforeseen ways, there's always the potential for perverse incentives. And lawmakers, the media certainly latched on to stories of fraud and abuse and welfare cheats and bumbling administrators. All of that rhetoric teaches citizens lessons about how government works. And I think this is one of the rich insights of the book, is its attention to public administration. You know, as political scientists and historians, in the media, we tend to focus on the passage of legislation. We don't pay enough attention to the implementation of it, right? But how that implementation is carried out really matters, because when citizens read news stories about welfare cheats, that affects their willingness to invest in the kind of collective efforts we need to be able to strengthen the safety net. There's a lot of things that we could do to make SSI a better, stronger program. It's not just SSI, but other programs for a disadvantaged population. But if what citizens get from the media and the rhetoric that they hear from their leaders is, well, government can't do this right, I think citizens start to wonder whether government can do anything right. And it tends to fuel the cycle of controversy and cutbacks and weakening political support for a program like SSI. When you read the book, you almost feel sorry for the people at the Social Security Administration who are trying to do a very complex task, oftentimes without the resources to do it, being asked to do it very, very quickly and without a whole lot of guidance. And whatever they do, they're criticized by the media. On the one hand, media is criticizing the SSA for being overly generous with the wrong people, but then overly stingy with the right deserving people. So no matter what they do, they're the subject of criticism. I think that if we were to think about, well, how does this impact us today? You know, keep in mind that right now the Obama administration is in the process of trying to roll out the Affordable Care Act, another progressive piece of legislation, a huge accomplishment. And a lot of the coverage has been very critical about states who are opposed to the Medicaid expansion, who don't want to set up exchanges, they're not cooperating. The Obama administration has had trouble rolling out the employer mandate. It's trying to get it out as fast as possible. so that people can see benefits, and at the same time, conservatives are trying to delay so that the process can look bumbling and then they can repeal the whole thing. I think that when we think about politically sustainable policy as reformers, one of the lessons that comes out of the book, one of the most important lessons, is that the battle isn't over once the legislation is passed. In fact, it's probably just begun.
So like Jennifer, I don't have pockets either. I'm starting to see something we have in common. But I am going to place mine on here instead of trying to carry it and multitask as effectively as she did. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me to be part of today's discussion. I think it's a really important conversation, and I'm also really pleased to have, through being invited, been forced to read the book, as opposed to just a few chapters or to skim. I felt the need, if you're going to be a responsible discussant, you actually have to read every word. Maybe that's because I'm still not that far out of law school. That being said, as someone who spends most of my time enmeshed in disability policy and really specifically in the Social Security programs, I really do expect that this book, which really serves more as really an extraordinary resource, is going to be something that's going to be on my shelf and on a lot of other disability advocates' shelves for a long time to come. It really is something of an extraordinary compendium of, am I doing the thing I'm not supposed to do where I'm moving my head and you can't hear me? Yeah, okay. It's really something that's an extraordinary compendium of legislative history, of programmatic history, both of proposals and of actual adjustments and changes that were implemented, key players, policymakers, agency officials, advocates, and media coverage, which really spans the 4 decades of the program. Now, the authors argue that SSI has failed, that it was intended to be one thing, that it became another, that faced with early implementation challenges, it became one of those early missiles that got 3 feet off the ground and then crashed, and that because it was adjusted over time in response to a changing policy environment, it has suffered policy erosion. And in addition, that because its beneficiaries ultimately suffered stigmatization akin to welfare recipients, that SSI has not accomplished its core mission. Now, looking at this rich array of facts and history, and using perhaps a different rubric of success, I and many other advocates for people with disabilities see things a little bit differently, which is that perhaps coming at this from the beneficiary's perspective, I would argue that SSI has been a success. Now, yes, one in need of improvements, and I think we're going to hear a lot about that in the second panel, but a success nonetheless. Now, first and foremost, one of the major successes of SSI is that it plays a crucial role in reducing poverty and helping vulnerable seniors and people with disabilities meet their basic needs. I think that that is a platitude we often hear about. I think what people often do not do is to take that and break it down and say, what does that really mean? And I think the best way to explore that, in addition to looking at what beneficiaries use the benefits for, is to ask, what is the alternative to having access to those benefits for many of these individuals? And I can say, as someone who works directly with beneficiaries as well as people who do not receive benefits, the alternative is very real hardship. It's homelessness, it's hunger, it's not being able to bathe because your water was shut off, it's not being able to microwave any food because your electricity was shut off, it's frigid winter nights without heat because your gas was shut off. It's inability to afford even basic co-pays for your needed medications and services, or to get a subway token so that you can make it to the doctor. I could go on, but I don't think I need to. SSI benefits are incredibly, incredibly modest. The maximum benefit this year is just $710 a month, and it's actually much less for most beneficiaries. It's about $530 or a little bit less per month on average. Now, this comes to about 75% of the federal poverty level at best. And for the vast majority of beneficiaries, as you'll hear probably from Jeffrey Hemmeter in a little bit, SSI provides their sole or primary source of income. That sounds pretty bleak, but on the other hand, according to SSA data, SSI has a powerful effect on reducing and blunting the worst effects of hardship. In 2010, it reduced poverty among beneficiaries by 1/3. For aged beneficiaries, that was from 67% to 48%. For disabled adult beneficiaries, that was from 67 to 44%. And for disabled child beneficiaries, it reduced poverty from 58 to 32%. SSI also has a tremendous effect in blunting extreme poverty, which is defined as 50% of the federal poverty level or less. 40% of SSI recipients in December 2002, and I can't wait to use updated numbers, lived in extreme poverty without counting their SSI benefit. When you did count the benefit, nearly 3/4 saw their incomes increase to between 50 and 99% of the federal poverty level with the SSI benefit. That's a dramatic difference. I'm not saying it's enough, but it is a dramatic difference for those people. Now, one of the reasons SSI is so effective at blunting poverty and extreme poverty is because over time, the program's rules have been adjusted incrementally to account for a changing policy environment. Now, one might call it policy erosion from an academic perspective, but from the standpoint of a beneficiary, having an exemption carved out so that LIHEAP, the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program, which helps many low-income people across this country pay their electric and gas bills so that they avoid shutoffs, especially in the winter, having that assistance not count against your income actually works so that programs that both impact the SSI, that impact or serve the SSI population do not work at cross purposes with the goal of SSI, which is that poverty reduction. Similarly, the Earned Income Tax Credit is another carve-out that makes a lot of sense looking at SSI from the perspective of how effective can we make this anti-poverty tool. So another important success of SSI is that in addition to supporting economic security among seniors and people with disabilities, SSI plays a key role along with Medicaid in helping to place independence and dignity within reach where it might not otherwise be possible. Young adults with disabilities aching to live independently but unable otherwise to do anything but live with family, people of all ages with mental impairments who have not been able to accrue a sufficient work history to receive benefits through disability insurance, children with severe impairments whose families might otherwise not be able to keep them at home and instead would need to put them in costly and isolating institutions. These are the alternatives that I'm talking about. As the authors note, until the 1960s, people with disabilities typically lived in large state-run institutions, isolated from families and communities. For me, that's just a history lesson. For many in this room, you saw that actually be the norm. In a 1962 survey, 71% of the public said that people with developmental disabilities should be cared for in institutions rather than at home. Our attitudes have happily changed since then, and SSI has been a key part of making that happen. In the decades following the deinstitutionalization movement, we have shifted from a system centered on costly and isolating institutions to a system that values and prioritizes community-based living where possible. And SSI, as I said, is a huge part of this history, and 4 decades after its inception, it continues to play a central role in that system today. I can give you an example. Take Will. He's 10, he lives with his parents and sister in Covington, Kentucky. Nearly from birth, Will's parents knew that he was different and something might be wrong. He was slow in learning to speak, and he learned to sign, as did the whole family, so that they could all communicate. He had frequent violent seizures, he struggled with anxiety, and he has memory problems. His mother, Katie, was forced to shut down her small business so she could stay home with Will when his care became a full-time job. And as Katie describes it, I surrendered my career so that Will's needs were met. SSI was what made it possible for us to focus on what Will needed. At one time, Will was unable to do anything for himself. He could not even feed himself. Now he can read. He can zip his own jacket. This is at age 10. For a parent with a child with a disability, the support that comes from SSI, in Katie's words, is a dream come true. When she talks about her son and when she talks about what SSI has meant to their family, she gets teary-eyed. The authors appropriately pay ample attention to something that I'll turn to next, which is the role of the media as a major player in affecting public opinion as well as driving public policy around SSI. Some of what they showcase in particular is how sensational anecdotes can drive major policy decisions. For instance, in a series of anecdotes publicized in the mid-90s by Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, CBS News, and myriad other news outlets, and this is laid out in great detail. This is why I'm glad I read every word of the book. All these news outlets jumped on what had quickly become a sensational headline. And what that media flurry, which was then sort of referred to as the crazy checks scandal, did was it drove major changes to the SSI Children's Program. It caused over 100,000 children with disabilities to be thrown off of SSI. These media accounts claiming that parents were supposedly coaching their children to act disabled for purposes of getting SSI were later shown by a series of more than a dozen independent and government studies to be unsubstantiated. Yet, Congress did not wait for all the facts to be in. They heard those awful stories that they heard in the media, and they sprang into action and engaged in legislation by anecdote, and that was not the only time. In today's political climate, this is a cautionary tale that I think is well worth noting. And I think a related lesson that I draw from this book is the popularity of scapegoating, otherizing and dehumanizing marginalized populations and blaming them for their situation. Now, this is something that I would argue is not the fault of the SSI program or of assistance programs generally, but of long-lived external animus that is not the fault of the program. Now, the goal, I'll close on this note. The goal underlying SSI's beginnings was to provide a positive assurance that the nation's aged, blind, and disabled people would no longer have to subsist on below poverty level incomes. And the goal in doing this at the time was that quote, "The way a nation treats its poor is one of the measurements of a just and humane civilization." Now, as illustrated by the data I shared earlier, SSI plays a powerful role in reducing that hardship. But as I also said, it is not perfect as is. We have a lot to do to build on and strengthen SSI. That's going to be the stuff of a second panel. And I would just ask that people really pay attention to what those folks, Paul Nathanson and Joan Entmacher in particular, discuss, because the financial eligibility rules, which are terribly outdated for SSI recipients, must be a central part of the conversation building on and strengthening this vital program. Thank you. That's why I can't put it up there.
Again, please join me in thanking all three of our panelists. I think this is a wonderful start. Thank you so much. We're moving on to our second panel, and again, looking forward to the third part of our session, which will be the open discussion among both panels and all of you. In this panel, our first speaker is Jeff Hemeter. He's an economist and deputy director of the Office of Program Development in the Social Security Administration. He's co-author of an authoritative report on the economic and demographic characteristics of SSI recipients, as well as disability insurance recipients. That updated report will be published soon, but we are fortunate to have kind of a preview of those findings in Jeff's presentation this morning. Then Joan Entmacher and Paul Nathanson will discuss ways to modernize the Supplemental Security Income program, as Rebecca noted. Joan is Vice President for Family Income Security at the National Women's Law Center, and Paul is Special Counsel and recently the Executive Director of the National Senior Citizens Law Center. The two of them will share a presentation on how to update SSI for current conditions, but we'll start with Jeff.
So I will need to stand up here even though I do have pockets because I have slides. So first I wanted to thank Lisa and Virginia for inviting me to present these results and for Nancy for holding this. I'd also like to thank Ed and Larry for writing a very good book that I thought. I'm glad I spent my hard-earned money on it because we don't have money to buy books in my office. So it was very worthwhile. I should say this work that I'm presenting is joint with Shelley Stegman, who couldn't be here today. And it's actually an update, as Rebecca pointed out, of prior work that I did with Anna Cesaro, who is also not here. And that in itself is an update of a prior work from other researchers in SSA. So I'm not going to take credit for the style of the report at all, just filling in new numbers. Thanks. So basically my job here is today is just to bombard you with statistics. Luckily you have them in the handout, so if you have any questions, refer to them or ask away. So this is going to be based on the survey of income and program participation. It's from the 2008 version. The data comes from 2010. It's the most recent data that we have available. We matched that to SSA administrative records. If there's no match in the survey, then we just use the survey self-reported information for SSI receipt. And the variables cover, and this is very important, the income covers September 2010 to December 2010. It's not yearly, so it's 4 months of data. All the other variables refer to December 2010. We weight all the numbers up to the SSA non-institutionalized population, and that is different from the population that is published in SSA reports. So the numbers will be a little bit different, but not too much. So let's start with, we'll break SSI into 3 groups. The age groups that correspond to programmatic definitions. There's children who are under age 18, adults 18 to 64, and the age 65 and older. In general, 58% of the SSI population is an adult, 16% are children, and 26% fall into the age category. As is generally known, child recipients are mostly male, but the adults in the age are mostly female. SSI recipients are mostly white, but there's a large percentage that are black. And there's in other races, there's a good percentage too, particularly with the aged group, that may be related to the immigration status of the aged population overall. Most SSI recipients are not Hispanic. Some basic demographic information. When we look at education, this is just for the adults and the age. The plurality of adults on SSI have 12 years of education. That's the green bar on the left. No, this does not necessarily mean they have a high school diploma. It just means that they have spent 12 years in the schooling system. For the age, the majority have less than 12 years of education, with the plurality having only 8 years or less of education. We do not report children for this because they're all going to fall in the first 2 columns. And we also have some disclosure issues with small sample sizes that we're not going to do that, to report them. And that's going to come up in other slides as well. So if you don't see children, that's why. Okay, if you look at the living situation, many SSI recipients live in non-family or group quarters. That includes single people. Also note these are not institutions. These are just group quarters where there's people who are unrelated living together, either by blood or by marriage. Many adults are in female-headed households, but there are also almost just as many married households and non-family or group quarters for adults. Just bombarding you with statistics, so just going to keep going through them. When we look at the housing type, most SSI recipients, as one would probably expect, do not own their home, although that is excludable. You're allowed to own a home. I should say, it's not that they don't own the home, it's that they live in a household where the home is not owned. So children probably don't own their own homes, but the parents might, like that. The age recipients, who are the green bars in this, are a little bit more likely to own their own home. However, they are also more likely to live in public housing. It's about 27% there. Children, about 18% live in public housing. When we look at other benefits, SNAP is received by about half the population, of half the households in the SSI population. But far fewer households actually receive energy or housing assistance. The elderly, the aged, are the least likely to live in households receiving any of these benefits, which was somewhat surprising to me. And so these, again, remember, these are based on self-reports. So, and in some other things I'm not reporting here, we did see some kind of funky responses, like Medicare and Medicaid might be getting mixed up. So some may not know the source of their assistance, and that may be reflected in their responses to the SIP. So it's always an issue with survey responses. This slide is a bit confusing. So this is SSI payments as a percentage of personal income. So when you look at the aged population on the right, for 35% of the population, that would be the dark blue top right section of the circle, SSI makes up less than 25% of their personal income. But if you look at the light blue section, that's 20% of the population. SSI makes up 100% of their income. And for the majority, it's less than 50%. So there would be the blue and the red, the 35 plus 20. For adults, 19% of the population, for adults, for 19% of the population, SSI makes up less than 25% of the personal income. But for 35% of the population, SSI makes up 100% of their personal income. Children basically have no other sources of income, so we don't include them in this chart. But if you want to look at other sources of personal income, you can see that the two blue bars on the left, some children do receive Social Security payments or public assistance other than SSI. We can see that there are large, here we can see why there are large differences in the percent of SSI contributing to personal income. For the aged, which are the green columns, almost 70% also receive Social Security income benefits, and that could either be a DI or an aged, well actually, for this population, it's mostly going to be aged. You can still receive DI up to age 67, or whatever the full retirement age is for the current population. And over 75% receive some form of public assistance other than SSI. For adults, 86% receive some form of other assistance than SSI. And note that individuals can be counted in more than one category in these charts. So that was personal income, and so this slide turns to family income, and this is, again, where it's very important to remember that these numbers are for 4 months of data. So while some families have a total income for 4 months of greater than $20,000, most, in fact, do not. 17% of child recipients have family income of less than $5,000 for 4 months, and 42% of adult recipients and 54% of the age recipients have less than $5,000 to spend over a 4-month period, personal income. When we look at the percentage distribution of family income for SSI recipients, we see that SSI payments, which are the red piece of the pie, account for 43% of a child's family income, 48% of an adult's family income, 37% of the aged family income. That's for all family members included. The 2 other items to note on this slide. For children, the family earnings, which is the purple section on the far left, family earnings make up a large portion of the family income, which is about 38%. And for the aged, family Social Security income, which is the dark blue section, makes up also 36% of the income. These are the numbers Rebecca actually mentioned earlier about family income relative to poverty. So SSI is, as the title of the book mentions, it is a welfare program. And so a question that's often asked is, how do SSI recipients fare relative to the poverty threshold? While we cannot say how behavior would change if SSI didn't exist, we can say in a static sense what their income would be if they didn't have SSI, if we just took it away right away. And in that sense, if you did not include SSI payments, 65% of recipients overall would live below the poverty threshold. including SSI payments, this is reduced by 1/3 to 43% of recipients. For a little more than 1/3 of recipients, family income, including SSI, provides income greater than 150% of the poverty threshold. When you look at the three age groups, the potential impact is large. For children, it goes from 58% below poverty to 32%. For the adults and for the aged, it goes from 67% to 44% and 48% respectively. So, as Virginia mentioned, this is a research note that should be released really soon. It will be up on this website. The prior version is also there, and the prior versions before that are in the SSI annual statistical report. And if you have any questions, please contact me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As the first panel explained, there have been a number of changes in the SSI program since it was enacted in 1972. But in some respects, it has literally not changed at all or changed only very slightly. And those are going to be the focus of my remarks. Not yet, but I have the sense to come on.
So the three things that I'm going to be talking about today are the general income exclusion, the earned income exclusion, and the resource or asset limit for eligibility for SSI. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the general income exclusion. And it's the amount of income other than earned income that is not counted in determining the SSI benefit. Every dollar above this exclusion amount reduces SSI benefits by $1. So, for example, take Alice, who has earned a Social Security benefit of $500 a month. She is the paradigm person that was in mind when SSI was created, as Ed has said. She gets to keep her $500 a month Social Security benefit. She gets her check. The SSI maximum benefit amount, as Rebecca said, is $710. Well, that is reduced by all but $20. So at the end of the day, she has an SSI benefit check worth $230 and her Social Security check, and she has a total of $730 in income, just $20 more than if she only got SSI and hadn't been working and paying into Social Security all those years. And what's striking about that $20 amount is that it is literally unchanged since 1972. If it had just kept pace with inflation, it would be worth $111 this year. Now, for some people, one is tempted to say, particularly some people in Congress, the difference between $20 and $111 a month might not seem like a lot of money. But let's see what it means to a beneficiary who is trying to live on a little over $700 a month. Using data prepared by Wider Opportunities for Women, the average cost of food for a single elderly person is about $8 a day. So $111 a month represents 2 weeks' worth of food. In contrast, $20 a month represents just 2.5 days' worth of food. That's a big difference. Updating this exclusion would help many SSI beneficiaries. I see from the prior presentation that my numbers are way out of date. They're from a couple of years ago, which said that more than half of aged SSI beneficiaries get Social Security. I see that should go up to 70%. The 1/3 of SSI beneficiaries 18 to 64 receiving Social Security, that's still a pretty good number. And those average amounts are way above what a modernized exclusion would be, so we could boost income for a large number of SSI beneficiaries simply by increasing and modernizing the disregard, although it would make a big difference, as Rebecca has said, but let's not get too excited. It would still leave them well below the federal poverty line. Okay, the next exclusion is the earned income exclusion. It's intended as a work incentive. The amount, there's a set amount of work earnings that are disregarded, and then above that amount, half of every dollar that's earned reduces the SSI benefit. The current earnings exclusion or disregard is $65 a month. Again, that is unchanged since 1972. If it had kept pace with the cost of living, it would be $362 a month. Again, let's try to make sense of what those numbers represent. If an SSI recipient was able to find a minimum wage job at which they could work, after 9 hours of work a month, they would hit the disregard amount of $65, and any earnings after that would be reduced by 50%. Remember, we're not willing to make very wealthy people pay a marginal tax rate of over 39.6%. This is a 50% tax on earnings. If they could find a minimum wage job and we modernize the disregard, they would be able to work up to 50 hours a week if they were able to find a job and the accommodations that made it possible for them to work that amount. Now, there are much smaller percentage of SSI beneficiaries who have earnings from work, slightly more in the 18 to 64 category, but those earnings are high enough that they would benefit from an increase in the disregard. And if we ever got other policies working so that more people did get the accommodations they need to work, this could make a difference in people's lives. And depending on the level of earnings, even bring some above the poverty line. The last is the resource limit, cash or other liquid assets or property that can be converted to cash. Some resources are excluded from the asset limit, a home, a car used for essential transportation, and household goods. The resource limit today is $2,000 for an individual, $3,000 for a couple, though is slightly higher than in 1972, but nowhere near the amounts if those were simply adjusted for inflation. So what are the consequences of saying you have to have no more than those asset limits? You have to be even poorer than poor to receive assistance, so you're much more likely to be homeless before you can qualify. You don't have a cushion to deal with extra expenses like the breakdown of a car or a home repair. And particularly, it's a disincentive to save, and this is especially true in an era where defined contribution plans, 401ks, have replaced defined benefit contributions. If a worker in the old days became disabled at 55, had earned a small pension, but needed income support now because he could no longer work, he could still get his pension at age 65. It would count against an SSI benefit under the income rules that I've outlined, and it wouldn't be earned income, it would be the $20, but at least you could get help in the meantime. Now, it's probably a defined contribution plan, and he has to spend down all of those hard-earned savings before he can get income support. So, are there any proposals out there to modernize SSI? Yes, a bill has been introduced in the House, the Supplemental Security Income Restoration Act. It would update the general income exclusion to $110 a month, the earned income exclusion to $357 a month, update the resource limit to $10,000 for an individual, $15,000 for a couple, index these values for inflation, and make other needed reforms. And that will be the subject of Paul's comments, as well as a discussion of some of the implementation issues which Ed highlighted as so important in the working of the program. Thank you.
Thank you again very much for having this panel, because the subject of SSI, when I find myself in conversations around Social Security and various other programs for the elderly, seems to always fall off the table. And the question that I would ask the rest of the panel, the academics perhaps especially, is why is that? And maybe there's an answer in the book. Why is it that the resource limit or all of the kinds of provisions that Joan alluded to have not been addressed? I mean, they're clearly issues of import to the poorest of the poor. Why is it when I yesterday spoke with a congressperson about this piece of legislation, someone in the House, I get a look that's, oh, that's important, but we're not going to deal with that. Why is it that poor people are not very high on the agenda? Let me, at least from my perspective, and I apologize in advance, I have to leave a little bit into the question and answer period because I'm going to again try at a luncheon to talk to a senator about trying to pursue this legislation. The National Senior Citizens Law Center was founded in 1972. I was there as the first executive director, and 1972, as you all heard, was the year that SSI was passed. We were funded as part of of OEO, and I know many of you probably vaguely remember OEO. A good friend of mine, Maggie Kuhn, who was the founder of the Grey Panthers, referred to it as the skirmish on poverty. Obviously, we still have poverty with us, and that's a good part of our discussion today. But being in legal services, we too, as Rebecca and John Stein, who she has worked with and I know is mentioned in the book, shows you I did read the book, at least, see clients where the rubber meets the road. And I'm really pleased that I think all the speakers have alluded to the fact that merely passing legislation is really only part of the answer. How do you really measure success? And I would say that success should be measured by how the program really plays out on the street. And we tend to see where the rubber meets the road with clients who are dealing with administrative processes. They're not really arguing necessarily about the benefit levels of the SSI program. So let me proceed. I'd like to talk briefly about two issues that we hope to address legislatively and that we would like to see Congress address: the in-kind support and maintenance rules and the transfer penalty. Both are extraordinarily harsh and result in hardships for the elderly, poor, and young people with disabilities. They also add a complexity to an already incredibly complex program, and we would argue that that complexity really doesn't have a great benefit, makes the program extremely complicated, takes inordinate amount of resources of the Social Security Administration, resources and staff which could be better used in addressing some of the other administrative issues that we'll talk about. So as I was saying, we believe simplifying some of these rules would add immeasurably to the efficacy of the program and the ease of administration. That would hopefully result in a more smoothly running program and one wherein the intended beneficiaries are more likely to actually see the benefits. So now, if someone lives in the household of another, whether or not it is a family member, he or she may be subject to a reduction in benefits equal to 1/3 the federal benefit rate, the reduction of $236, bringing the maximum benefit to $474 a month. My figures, I hope, are accurate. But in any case, it's a 1/3 reduction. The in-kind support and maintenance rule is quite complex, imposes a sometimes unbearable financial burden on SSI recipients and their families, as well as, I alluded to, the administrative burden. How does a Social Security Administration worker decide the value of 1/3 of that home? Is it 2 bathrooms? Is it a condo? Is it with swimming pool? How do you spend your time? I mean, in other words, Social Security having to spend its time dealing with this with probably not a very great payback. We also feel that the transfer penalty that Congress enacted in 1999 should be repealed. The SSI transfer penalty results in a period of ineligibility when someone transfers a resource to another person. This transfer penalty applies even if SSI recipient is paying an informal loan from a family or a friend. It has a Byzantine set of exceptions which add to the administrative burden, again, and make errors inevitable, especially when SSA is understaffed and not trained to deal with these kinds of issues. The rest of what I have to say is drawn really from the transition report. Joan and I co-chaired a committee, the Adequacy Committee of Social Security Works, and I hope you'll all see a copy of this that deals with a lot of these administrative issues. We need to ensure that those who apply for, receive, or are denied benefits understand what they are told and in a language they know. While the Social Security Administration has been a leader in providing much of its benefits information in various languages, in 2003, more than 38% of all SSI applicants aged 65 and over, who were by definition extremely poor, asked for interviews in a language other than English. Advocates nationwide say that people are often asked by local offices to bring their own interpreters. SSA policy clearly states that the agency must provide an interpreter free of charge upon request, and children cannot be used. SSA should do more to ensure that this is uniformly applied. We need to commit to build for better public understanding of the Social Security and SSI program, greater outreach, and education about the availability of the program. We might consider sending a reminder about possible SSI eligibility periodically, and especially with low Title II individuals with low Title II benefits. We would request greater increased funding for outreach to homeless individuals because, as we all know, less than the full percentage of people who are entitled to SSI currently get it. SSA should adhere to the law relating to the appeals process so that people who follow the rules are not penalized. Over 40 years ago, the Supreme Court, in the case of Goldberg versus Kelly, said that individuals should have a hearing while their aid is pending. While their appeal is pending, and should have benefits while their appeal is pending. That's in the regulations, but in our experience is followed often very rarely. While there are rules on the books, as I say, to reflect that, some of this may have to do with better training and messages sent by leadership about due process and protections that people deserve and need. SSA needs to develop, are we at the 0 yet? Oh, got it, okay. And in conclusion, the report makes the case that however well-intentioned or great federal statutes are, and this is what I am always saying, it doesn't really matter unless it plays out on the street. And why it doesn't play out on the street, probably fault goes all around. But that measure of success, winning a case in the Supreme Court, getting a piece of legislation passed, our mothers are proud of us. But does it really do anything for the intended beneficiaries? And I'm very pleased, again, that the speakers have addressed the fact that we need to look at the administrative side of these programs because that's really where the rubber meets the road. Thank you.
Thank you all. And now we will have the original speakers come back and join us. And it is our chance to hear comments and questions from you all in the audience. So as soon as we get all hooked up with our electronic amplification, we'll be good to go. Do you have any, I see one hand up. I will repeat your question.
Okay, I'm from the Office of Disability Employment in the Labor Department, and I noted in your presentation that 4.8% of people with disabilities who are on SSI are working, that are working age. And while that's an extremely small number, it does strike me as a jump in recent years, because I believe about 5 years ago it was about 1.2%. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. We're of course very interested in changes to the SSI rules that would promote working and early intervention on people who would become disabled, possibly before they get on disability benefits.
So the question is, there's been some increase in employment among working age people who receive SSI, but more importantly, what might be done to improve employment opportunities for people receiving SSI? Comments or questions?
I would just say there are a lot of ideas out there for early intervention for DI and SSI. David Stapleton, David Otter, Mark Duggan, Rich Berkhauser. There's a lot of things out there about doing something before they get to SSI or DI, because there is somewhat of a sense that once they get to us at SSA, I don't want to say all hope is lost, but it's a long road back. There's a decline in human capital, there's a decline in social networking, all these things which are just adding barriers to, especially for SSI, poverty and disability. So there's an active, I wouldn't say it's an agenda, but there are a lot of people who are working on that, and I think ODEP in particular is part of the discussion, but I don't know everybody who's involved. So.
Ed?
Can I speak to that? That's another real cottage industry in academia in Washington and elsewhere, as Virginia could tell you, and as many of the people probably in this room could tell you. And it's a good example, it seems to me, of how that's such an attractive prospect, that people on disability, people with disabilities should work, that it's just worth kind of, reinventing and reinventing and reinventing and reinventing. But this has been thought about for a very, very long time, and the track record has actually been very, very poor with that. So that if it is a good example, if you really want to change that, you probably have to change the definition of disability in SSDI, which would also change the definition of disability in SSI. But that brings us to another problem, which is a general problem for this discussion, which is that you could talk about optimal changes and so on and so forth, but right now it's very hard to affect those changes, because the problem is that the advocates would probably agree that there are many flaws in the SSI program, and there are people deeply committed to expanding it. But I would suspect, and they can talk about this, they're very wary of kind of opening up the question, though, so that we can just look at it and the people in the House can kind of thoroughly examine the SSI program, so on. So that what happens in a case like that, I think, and maybe you could talk about it, is that we tend to keep what we have. That the advocates, liberals say, well, it's not the best, but it's what we have. And that's the case here, that to do anything with working incentives really would involve a massive kind of social legislation, which does not, at least to my mind, look like it's coming up anytime soon. Maybe you guys would like to.
Yeah, I think the bigger problem now is that is probably, and I can't quantify this, many people who have serious disabilities who haven't applied for, can't qualify for DI benefits or SSI, rather than people who are on these programs and actually able to work. I mean, that's what Congress and the media focus on. They try to find some, example of somebody who could work and is on the program, ignoring what's happening to all the people who have serious disabilities who are on the program and are still poor, or people who aren't getting help and are homeless and don't know about the program. As Paul said, the problem of outreach. So yeah, I'd agree there is some apprehension about focusing on, putting recipients back to work, They have been through a very strict process of qualifying for benefits. Some could work with support if employers were more willing to make accommodations, if there were more supports to help people get to work and stay on the job. I mean, particularly in this labor market, it's really hard to imagine, where so many people who don't have disabilities are finding it difficult to find work. And the economy is still so weak that we're really going to make the investments necessary to make a major dent. So I agree, there's a kind of, it would be great because there are people who really would like to go back to work. And if, at the point where SSI no longer is the main route to Medicaid, when we can solve the health insurance problem for people with disabilities without tying it to this assistance, that will be a step forward, but in the meantime, it's tough.
I wanted to piggyback on that as well. I apologize, Virginia, that's going to be a popular question. I think we can all get behind the idea of early intervention. I think that that's an important idea and proposal that we should all be thinking about. I think, however, it's really important when we're talking about, am I producing feedback? Is that my fault? I'm closer to my mouth. Okay, thank you. I think while we're having a conversation about early intervention, still getting feedback. I'm a troublemaker. I think while it's really important and really beneficial for us all to be having a conversation about early intervention, I think it's easy to get caught in a narrative that goes back to something I raised before, which was scapegoating. I think that the disability programs, the Social Security disability programs, are frequently blamed for low work participation by their beneficiaries. And I think that that's sort of a mistaken conclusion, given that the purpose of the programs is to provide income support. It's not to get people to work. That's not why they were established. Now, I think we need to focus on, and there has been a lot of attention over a matter of decades, for making it as easy as possible for those people who are receiving disability benefits to try working, do as much work up to their capacity, and then possibly return to work if that's a possibility for them. That's an important thing that we need to continue to focus on. But blaming the programs for low work participation by a population that is defined as having the most significant impairments of anyone in the country, I think is a little bit of an exercise in scapegoating. The other, I'm glad that Joan raised the issue of decoupling the gateway to health insurance and to accessing services from disability benefits, because that absolutely is something we hear all the time from our clients, we advocates. I need that health insurance, I need to be able to get personal care assistance, et cetera, whatever it is, and forcing people to access those benefits and those services through an income support program is something that I think doesn't necessarily make sense, and I hope we make strides on. I think the other proposal that's out there is to make work pay more. We could actually significantly enhance the work incentives, especially in SSI, by making that earned income disregard more generous, and that's something that's been proposed for a number of years. So perhaps instead of it being 50%, having it be that for every $2 you make, you only lose $1 in your benefits. There are other ways, I think, to think about this too.
Other comments?
Yes.
That's you.
Yeah, thanks. John Tavernino, Health and Human Services. A comment and a question. The comment for Jeff Hemminger, when you seem to be a little surprised that the SNAP enrollment was much higher than energy assistance and housing assistance for this population, if that's correct, I would note that both of those, the various programs that fall under energy and housing assistance are capped programs, that when you look at their penetration into the eligible population, it's very low. Energy assistance is well under a quarter of persons who are income eligible, simply because it's a fixed amount of resources. The pie only goes so far. So you might want to compare these households to the non-SSI households at that income level to see whether how the access to those benefits varies. And to the extent that SNAP is uncapped, in some ways it's surprising that only 70% are receiving it, and that virtually all of them are eligible for SNAP. So that's the question or the comment rather. The question for Professors Berkowitz and Berkelwater, I wonder if you could just reflect further on really the bifurcation of the welfare state and how SSI is crucial to one pole of that. if you compare SSI to the TANF program and the various other block grant programs, the SSI program, relatively speaking, is much more generous. It's much more uniform. It's much more centralized. There are far greater administrative resources. SSA is under a lot of pressure now, but it's still far more professional, far more adequately staffed than many local human services offices that have gone through a whole revolution of contracting out and whatnot, and a real erosion of their capacity. For SSI, states have a minimal role, as you're saying. It's really the BDS, which are quasi-independent at best, and the state supplements. And aside from that, the states are extremely marginal. So just think more and more about in terms of block granting and devolution and decentralization, that's characteristic of most of the safety net programs, with notable exceptions like SNAP, and SSI, which is just very centralized and extremely stable. Whether you see sort of a growing bifurcation as you got these two different tracks.
Did everyone hear the question?
Essentially, ask our two academic speakers to contrast the experience with Supplemental Security Income, which remains federal, and the remaining welfare program, which used to be AFDC and is now TANF and block granted to the states.
I think that that's a really good question, and it raises many important issues to think about. So I think probably it's a mistake to think about programs individually to really understand what's happening in them. You have to think about the context in which they're situated in. And I think that rather than saying, well, there's this bifurcation between AFDC, TANF, and SSI, I think I would propose that it looks this way, where on the one hand, TANF/AFDC was a highly stigmatized program. It's the easiest of the means-tested programs to pick off. And so in 1996, it was block granted, devolved, and there's a lot of evidence that as weak as this recovery has been, that people are not able to get on to TANF. And what's happening is that that need is being channeled in other directions. And I would say the two important programs that have arisen to take the place of TANF has been, one, the earned income tax credit, so that if you work, it's an even more important part of that safety net. There are limits to which that program can work, especially in an environment where jobs are hard to get, even for people who don't have medical impairments. And then SSI is the other piece. And I think that there has been some interest in the overlap between the eligible population between AFDC /TANF and SSI. For some conservatives, that means, well, what we should do is go and cut SSI even more, and I think that would really eviscerate the safety net. Some of the need is also being channeled in other directions, like unemployment insurance, which is also time limited, varies by state. Food stamps has been another program that tries to ameliorate need. And so I guess I would say, rather than there just being a bifurcation between TANF and SSI, that all these other programs are having to step up to the plate to play in some way the safety net role that TANF used to play, and not all of them are well equipped to play that role. And I'll just mention really quick the childhood benefits, because it's a big part of Ed's book, and I think where some of that overlap is quite evident. I think one of the tragedies that comes out of SSI is that it can be a safety net for families who have children with medical impairments. There's a lot of controversy about whether we're just medicalizing bad behavior that provides fodder for all these media stories, even though a lot of them are not substantiated. But then the other problem is, well, what happens to these kids when they age out of SSI? We just had this conversation about early intervention, and there's not a whole lot of support for these children and their families about how do they become independent adults, because a lot of them aren't going to qualify for the adult benefits when they age out at 18, and there's some evidence that the children who are aging out of SSI, even though they don't qualify as adult disabled recipients, are still not living much above the poverty line, and oftentimes have run-ins with the criminal justice system. They're not being able to hold down steady jobs.
Can I just add one thing to that? I just want to say that there actually are kind of youth transition issues are a big part of the research agenda that's been going on in terms of return to work. A lot more is focusing on that. There's the youth transition demonstration at SSA, which is focusing on youths ages 15 to 24, 14 to 25, I forget the exact number. And also Department of Education, Labor, Health and Human Services, and SSA are doing this thing called the Promise Initiative, promoting readiness of minors and SSI. And so that's actually currently being competed. And so that is one thing that is very big in right now.
For a little bit more information on those programs, there's actually in your folder, very thoughtfully included, a brief on SSI for Children, which at the very end actually gives some background information on those programs.
So we know that things might not improve very much, but we do know there's going to be big research grants on this transition to adulthood, so it'll be beneficial to someone. Can I just say real quick that about that question? Here's another way to think about it. AFDC wasn't always stigmatized. It took until the 1950s. At first, it was a fairly respectable program for women whose husbands had died and left behind children, right? That's point number one. Point number two, the real key moment here is 1996, where in 1996, it could have been the case that TANF was created. In fact, it was created, which was a de-evolution, in a sense, back to the States. But it also could have been the case that in a sort of a complementary move, they just took out SSI as well and did somehow block granted. And there were proposals, very serious ones, in 1996 for the childhood benefits to be handled in that way. But it didn't. So it has, in that sense, you're right, it's successful. It achieved it's preserved its federal administration. It's preserved some of its competence at an administrative level. That's true. On the other hand, it's also true that contrary to what anybody thought, business with the childhood benefits, for example, the idea that the mothers are coaching the children, that is so strikingly similar to the what's talked about in AFDC, the mothers are irresponsible toward their children or just trying to get on the rolls. That happened is unfortunate, And so yes, SSI has, in some senses, done better than AFDC TANF, but the fact that it's got those similarities is also, I think, somewhat troubling.
Well, I think part of what's interesting, though, is that, you can talk about the administrative and kind of just structural bifurcation, which I think is an interesting point, and I'm not going to piggyback on what they've said with that respect, but I think actually, as you just mentioned, part of what's interesting is that the very concept of welfare has become itself stigmatized. It's a word that gets thrown around like a four-letter word, like an expletive. And so to call SSI a welfare program actually has increasingly become a loaded and full of connotation device. And so when people, whether they're members, in a hearing, or whether they're, reformers who want a block grant, whatever it is, they actually find as a very powerful rhetorical device using the concept and the word of it has become a welfare program, or it's just like welfare, as a tool for fueling negative political opinion that feels that something needs to happen to change welfare as we knew it. Why is it that every talk I get problems?
Because when the two things are open like that, that's what
I don't know what the beeping is. Maybe someone up there doesn't want me to make these points. Okay, it's the NSA.
They don't like what you're saying.
They're paging me. So all that being said, I find that interesting that the very stigma that you were describing has itself become its own source of animus, and that it no longer even has to be the people that we're talking about or the marginalized populations, but just the very fact of being, quote, a welfare population. I have no idea what this noise is. It's this one? Okay, well, that was my point.
Can I follow up on a point? I think another point, and this, it struck me when Ed was talking about that AFDC wasn't always a stigmatized program. It became a stigmatized program when it began to enroll some of the most neediest poor people in the United States. That is, African Americans who are moving out of the South into urban centers where local administrators weren't administrating family assistance in a discriminatory manner, and then SSI becomes stigmatized in the context of welfare reform when it starts to enroll lots of people who were technically eligible for the program but were not big parts of the program. That is, low-income children with disabilities, the homeless, AIDS, HIV recipients. And so part of it is, the fact that we scapegoat and stigmatize these populations, and when they finally claim the help because they're eligible for it, the programs then become stigmatized.
And the history, I think, is fascinating, but what's so interesting to me is how pervasive and how long-lasting what we saw in the 80s with Reagan really has become and continues to be. I think that kind of, the birth of the welfare queen is very much still with us and still really echoes in the halls of any room where anyone's having a conversation about SSI, or even just more broadly disability benefits. I mean, what's fascinating is when you look at focus group data on people who are asked I was actually at a presentation a couple days ago. They were revealing focus group data on what are your associations with the word disability, and the most common word association was fraud. And they weren't even talking about disability benefits, they were talking about disability. And I thought that was striking because what it really means is, first of all, there's the association to the benefits, but second of all, that there is this incredibly pervasive popular misconception that has really replaced any facts or truth about the program or about who receives the benefits. Everybody seems to know that person who shouldn't be getting benefits, but doesn't really seem to know the person that they think actually is helped by them. And it really fits that kind of otherization, and I don't know, I was really struck by that data.
Yeah, I would just like to make one comment here as well on the I'm talking about in 1996 and the SSI children, that there was a real move to try to block grant the SSI Kids program, and at the same time there was, our organization had a disability policy panel underway, and we kind of took a subcommittee of our group and said, what's going on with the SSI children's issue, and came up with a special report that kind of tried to identify, so what is the truth here? What do the data show? And we came up with some insights and recommendations and some reality. And there was also a commission appointed, a federal commission on childhood disability, and they came up with some facts and some recommendations, and it did significantly mitigate this kind of group mentality that based on misconception and anecdote. So there's sometimes a chance for facts to intervene. But yes.
Rebecca, I know you have a lot of experience of seeing people, clients. I guess that when I think about the vision that certain folks have in the policy of a world without the federal government involved in anything, it makes me think, well, what would the world be like for someone 85 years old living in Philadelphia who currently has SSI and food stamps and Medicaid? What would that world be like without those programs? How would you describe it? Or say it's Molly and she lives in West Philly in a rundown place she doesn't own. What would that world look like?
Well, I think it's partly what I tried to illustrate in my opening remarks of kind of what's the alternative, and it's this incredible hardship that I think is really unthinkable for anyone who hasn't either really experienced it or I guess seen it very closely firsthand. It's that it's hunger, all the programs you named, it's homelessness, it's, if you're lucky, doubling up with another family member or friend. I mean, I think a striking on-the-ground encounter that many folks in Pennsylvania have had in the last year and a half or so has been our state eliminated the general assistance program. We went the way of a lot of other states. This is an increasing trend. And it was just for budget cuts. It really didn't actually save all that much. But what it meant was that 70,000 Pennsylvanians lost their sole source of income, which was at that point $205 because it hadn't been raised in God knows how long. But people were finding a way to scrape by on $205, whether it was renting a room, whether it was because it helped them, pay for the bus fare, co-pays, that kind of thing. And many of those folks were folks who had disabilities but who had failed to access SSI. I think what we've drawn from that and watching what has happened with the elimination of GA, pulling that rug out from under 70,000 people, has been, first of all, an incredible increase in doubling up. Almost nobody lives, and this is from the low-income clients of a legal services provider in Philadelphia, we don't see people anymore who kind of just live in rent a room or who have an apartment or even who live in necessarily public housing in nearly the numbers that we saw before. Everybody is living in households of 6, of 7, of 8, and they aren't necessarily people they're related to. They're all trying to find a way to scrape by. So I think that's one thing we've seen. The other thing we've seen is that people actually become less well able to access even those other sources of support because they can't keep up with, say, the bureaucratic hurdles of remaining eligible for food stamps or for Medicaid. They fail to turn in a piece of mail because they never got the mail in the first place because they didn't have a stable address anymore, and so they lose their health insurance. And so this was just pulling out one of those legs of the stool as opposed to all of them. I think we can imagine the worst, and it would be right about right if we were to just completely eviscerate and eliminate all in one fell swoop what exists in the forms of government support, which on their own are not necessarily sufficient, but are really something.
Yes, right here.
Don Caristi, I'm with SSA. How can we have a coherent discussion about this issue if we have such dissonance in the meaning of disability? If we have this cacophony of definitions and conceptions of what we're talking of populations that we're talking about, I'm just wondering if that's interrupting our ability to actually think coherently about this. I mean, because I'm listening to, I seem to be listening to several conversations here about different groups of people, but it comes back to one program which has one definition of disability.
Could I just say one thing?
Did everyone hear the question? Sort of, how do we cope with so many disparate concepts of what do we mean by disability?
I just kind of wanted to piggyback on that. I mean, across the federal government, there are I think some 26 different definitions of disability. So what it means for SSA is probably among the most strict and has been largely unchanged since the 50s. So, that is a discussion that's worth having, but that's all I have to say.
I mean, this is a question that's come up with a lot again. But let me just tell you a story, okay, that goes to this. At one point in the history of SSI, I don't remember when, maybe the 1980s, for some reason all the congressmen at the hearing were gone. You can probably picture this. So only the staffers were there, and the staffer asked questions, and the staffer who was there was the SSI guy, Alan Jensen. He was the expert on SSI. So he said to we're talking about mental health, mental illness, and he said, maybe the problem is that the SSI definition, which serves this disproportionate number of people with mental illness, it really shouldn't be the same as the SSDI definition. And in the chair testifying was Elizabeth Boggs, whom some of you may remember, who was quite the grande dame of developmental disability legislation and very influential in that, and very elegant and very smart lady. And she said, oh, no, none of us want that. None of the disability advocates want that, because we feel we want to have the definition of SSDI and SSI disability be the same, because we think it really benefits our clients. We think that association actually benefits our clients. And that was the end of the discussion. So that's an interesting moment, right? We as academics could say, gee, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but there are reasons why things are the way they are, and that's a good example of it, I think.
There's also an administrative argument to be made, right? I mean, if we're talking about let's simplify and let's make this work, and Congress has, been failing to sufficiently fund SSA for, how long at this point? If we had, Scott Fry in the room right now, he could give us figures about how sorely underfunded you guys are. To separate the definitions of disability would be a mammoth task that would mean, a whole other undertaking, and also just an incredibly I think, laborious and administratively burdensome thing on an ongoing
Right, and
basis.
if you think about this a little bit further, one of our problems is that we don't see that this is a dynamic system. So if someone says, okay, we're going to have a new definition for SSI now, it's going to be more, in a sense, lenient. It's going to catch more of the people that are needy. Well, one of the things that somebody might say then is, well, that's fine, that's a good idea. And it really suggests that disability is a local kind of problem tied to the local labor market, local institutions. So if we're going to change the definition of disability for SSI, we think that the states should really be the determinants of who's disabled under SSI in a way that they're really not quite today. And that ups the ante a little bit, right? It makes it a little less attractive. And so on, that we can think about these, one of the problems we have, I think advocates, if I may say, they talk about if we didn't have SSI, if we didn't have Social Security, what would happen? But again, it's more complicated than that, right? As we saw with the implementation of the 1996 welfare reform, which everyone predicted was going to be a disaster. Maybe it was, but it was certainly different than what people predicted. At any rate, it's hard, we have to think ahead about these things, and that there is no simple kind of thing. As Rhoda Davis used to say, who was one of the SSA people who was involved in disability administration, you can't make policy by anecdote, and unfortunately that's what happens a lot, is we get the controlling anecdote, and it often leads us into trouble.
I just wanted to make one other point, which is that I think it's an important question. I think it's also one of the problems with having this conversation with a lot of folks is that most people don't understand the Social Security definition of disability. So the word disability itself, not as a technical term, is a broad term, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. Social Security, as you well know, has a very precise definition of disability, which is not about who is disabled. It's much more based on working capacity, and it's working capacity as defined at who can work at SGA. And so that definition was designed because SSA was administering a program that had a purpose, which was income support for people unable to work at a certain minimum level. I think that's a very precise definition of disability, and there's a reason that it's different than those other 26 or however many other definitions, which were constructed and continue to be constructed for programs that serve other purposes.
One could turn that around, of course, say it's a very precise definition. That's why the roles have been so stable over time.
Well, I think,
because it's,
well, as I think you made a point about mental impairments being overrepresented in the program. Actually, if you look at the data, and I won't get into a tit for tat, but I think that's a point that should be responded to. The increase in the share of people who receive benefits who have a primary impairment, which is a mental impairment, actually matches the broader world of disability, and that's according to both United States data and WHO data. So I think that's a point worth making. So it isn't, I think we often look at what's going on within SSI or within SSDI, but we have to take a step back and look at that broader context and say it's a reflection of what's going on in that broader world.
Well, there is one more.
I think the concluding comment there.
You should give the concluding comment.
Well, I did want to make a point about the increase in the disability roles, which have occasioned a lot of comment recently, which is, and the Social Security actuary has done a wonderful job of breaking out, why the disability roles have increased. Most of it is demographics. Two things: there are baby boomers hitting, and near baby boomers hitting the ages where disability are most common. Women are now qualifying for Social Security disability benefits. That relates more to the increase in Social Security disability claims than SSI, but with more time in the workforce, they're eligible for Social Security disability benefits. And really the remarkable thing, and Gina, I think, was the one who discovered this going back to early reports by the Social Security actuary, predicted that the Disability Trust Fund would start needing an influx of resources from the other trust fund around about 2016. This was coming, this was totally predictable. This is not suddenly people claiming to be disabled and meeting a very, very strict definition of disability, that in fact it's the result of trends in the population, and that's why disability roles have increased, both in Social Security and SSI.
Paired with some of the remarkable outreach efforts that your book is actually really quite excellent in outlining.
Fabulous. We're near the end, but I guess I'd come away with a strong conclusion that, one, we need to do more of this kind of session on the Supplemental Security Income Program, but also more on the broader question of disability and disability benefits, because certainly we don't have all the answers yet. So please join me in thanking all of the members of our panel for a really good